All right, my job is to keep you all from falling asleep after lunch. Um, I am the director for the other Livability Center, which is the small urban and rural livability center. I work at Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana, and we are partners with North Dakota State University in Fargo, North Dakota. Our whole focus was how do we take livability principles and make them work in small urban and rural areas, because many people tend to think of livability as a large urban issue. And so our focus was, again, how do we make this work in smaller communities? So we'll talk about livability very quickly. This audience is very knowledgeable about it. Most of you are working at a center, partners with a center talking about it. We'll talk about this project we did at actually looking at livability in state departments of transportation, and then I think we'll hold all the questions till the end. But again, livability is a national partnership, EPA, HUD, and USDOT. So on a national level, they set the framework for how the federal government in general was viewing livability. Again, the 6 livability principles are here. It's about providing those transportation choices and options to people, looking at how we build our housing. Are we supporting existing neighborhoods and communities, or are we basically working against them? Again, how do we build our communities? How do policies and funding support those decisions? And are we making those communities such that there are a lot of transportation options for people? So really the goal of our project was a very basic look at saying, has that term livability, have those principles really found themselves from that national perspective and that national partnership down to the state departments of transportation? So what we did is we looked at DOT websites, and we basically did a search to say, do we see the term livability? Do we see livability principles? We also looked at certain documents to say, were there documents on the website? So it might not be up front on the website that says, livability is a strong component of the Wisconsin DOT, but are there documents within that website that talk about livability and livability principles? So if we found that on the website, then we went in and looked at the definitions they used, were all the principles there, that kind of a thing. And then also we wanted to see if the states are tracking progress on implementation. But it's great to have a goal, but to say, well, I'm not going to measure if I ever get there, you go, well, it's maybe a real pointless goal. So this is what we found. We found 25 state departments of transportation that basically had defined livability. We found 3 more states that had a definition of sustainability, but it was very close to livability, so we decided to include it. It's kind of interesting. You see, the West Coast and East Coast, some stuff in the middle, but there's a pretty big gap there kind of in the heartland of our nation. So when we started looking at a little more detail of the definition, we found that a lot of them, over half, talk about public health and safety. There was some discussion this morning about safe routes to school and some other things that, a lot less kids are walking to school, and we see childhood obesity rates going way up. And so a lot of livability is somewhat tying into this discussion of public health and transportation. Over half of the definitions talk about economic development, access to good jobs, that they're saying livability has this economic benefit. Half talk about that principle of having choices or options. So livability means more than we're just all going to get in our car and drive somewhere, that there are other options for people to use. They'll talk about choices, options, or multimodal activities. So these are just some examples that we pulled from different states. So talking about the quality and location of transportation facilities. Some of them will tie it into conditions. You say it could go back to the road network, access to jobs, affordable housing, transportation choices. Connecticut, physically and socially desirable places to live, fairly broad. And so then some of that gets to be how these broad definitions then get put into practice. Iowa, it talks about a well-connected transportation network, a lot of choices. Again, access to jobs, housing, schools, and other amenities, so kind of the community view. When we talk about sustainability, some of those definitions then, in Illinois, talk about health, the natural environment, planning objectives, so again, economic and social well-being, so not quite as focused on the 6 livability principles, but some of that language and those principles are there. Missouri, again, looking at balancing environmental community needs, economic needs. They talk about kind of a longer view here when they talk about future generations, that we're not making decisions just about now and the present, but taking a longer view. And then when we looked at implementation, again, it's great to have these goals, and whether it's livability or sustainability, and say we're going to do something, but then how do we actually implement it? Is it complete streets policies? How do we actually fund our system to reach these goals? So again, we see a lot of these policy discussions, complete streets. You hear the word context-sensitive solutions a lot. The solution should fit the context where it's being implemented. We see it in plans and projects, whether it's road diets, we're going to shrink what's given to the automobile and make that available to cyclists or pedestrians or other modes. We see a lot of implementation through advisory committees. So we're going to have bike ped committees, transit committees, sustainability committees. And those are the people who are going to make sure that the work we're doing is moving towards that livability or sustainability goal. So there's only 4 states, and we include the District of Columbia in this discussion. So California, the District of Columbia, Massachusetts, and Washington that actually have specific performance measures. So again, it's important when you have a goal to say, how am I measuring my progress to achieving that? The measurements can be pretty specific. A lot of them focus on reducing the vehicle miles traveled. So that's one you see a lot. A lot will be how many more miles of bike paths did we create? Did we add sidewalk networks, trail networks, those things? Some of them are much more easily measured than others. Some of the very general measurements, we're just talking about, the degree to which the vision was achieved. Did we become more livable, more sustainable? That's a little more nebulous to measure. There's discussion of levels of satisfaction with projects. So, we built a new trail. Is everyone happy with it? Okay, that moved us towards our goal of being more livable. So, some are very specific and data-driven, a couple more qualitative than quantitative. But I think it's important that even for those states that talk about being livable, very few are actually measuring toward that. So, William Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet said, "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." So we have questions like, well, why haven't 23 states adopted this term? I was actually at a TRB session when people from some DOTs said, we don't use the term livability, we can't use the term livability. They tend to use the discussion, the most frequent term they'll use is best practices or context-sensitive solutions. For some people, for some reason, I guess livability has a very socialistic ring to it or something. So a lot of people don't use that. The other question then is, does it matter what we call livability, quote unquote, as long as we achieve its principles? If best management practices, context-sensitive solutions gets us to these goals, do we say, well, you have to call it livability then? So something to think about. And certainly with the current administration, are we going to be focusing on infrastructure and not even talking about transportation in general, or certainly livability? I've been on calls with, and Dr. O might too, with Rhetoric, the kind of lobbying arm of the University Transportation Centers. And our lobbyists more or less said, if you're a UTC right now that talks about livability, sustainability, and those things, don't be out there promoting yourself. Keep your head down, do your work, but kind of stay off the grid for right now. So, I think we have a ways to go, but we'll see where we're going. I think we're holding questions to the end, so I thank you for your time.